So please, what I'm going to say here, please don't take it as a contribution or as an attempt to contribute to the esoteric discussion of esotericists about the essence of esotericism, but the question, how can it help us to, this term help us to understand historic phenomena? Before I would like to embark on this enterprise, I would like to make two preliminary remarks. First, regarding the definition of the term esotericism, here we have the famous definition of Febvre, which is, of course, much disputed. What I find problematic in this model, at least for my purposes as a historian of astrology, is a certain mixture of characteristics of two fundamentally different kinds. On the one hand, the term esoteric can and does in these definitions or in these characteristics refer to the object of knowledge. Esoteric beliefs can be based upon the assumption that there are hidden occult powers, unexplainable, inexplicable correspondences, mysterious transmutations, as it moves automatically. So all kinds of occult powers, unexplainable correspondences, mysterious transmutations, and so on. Yeah, you think so? Okay. So I have to speak even faster now.
I'm going to sit next to you just in case I think about it. It's okay, I get it in print.
Okay, all this refers to the actual objects of esoteric knowledge, or the theoretical foundation of its functioning. In other words, some of these characteristics actually differ to the characteristics of the object, whereas others refer to the knowledge itself, not to the objects. For example, the teacher-disciple transmission of knowledge and so on, and the social, political background and so on. That's esoteric of a different kind. So I would like, for my purposes at least, to make this a rather clear distinction between esoteric as designing objects of knowledge and the status of knowledge. The second preliminary remark is the following. Both in historical sources and in modern research, the term astrology refers to actually quite distinct phenomena. On the one hand, we have astrology, which designates teachings that argue for the influence of the stars on human fate and or the possibility to predict human destiny through the knowledge of the movements of the stars. This is what I would like to call judicial astrology. On the other hand, we have astrology for the magical usage for astral magic. Both forms of astrology have, of course, the common denominator that they both assume that the stars have some kind of crucial influence on the terrestrial world, or are at least somehow closely related to it. But as we will see, both forms of astrology reveal numerous differences, which makes it necessarily here and there, in many places actually, to keep them apart. So with these two remarks in mind, I will now try to reconstruct a kind of short outline of the status of astrology as an esoteric science as it developed from classical antiquity, ancient Christianity, and early Islam, and I will actually end at the moment when astrology re-entered Western intellectual discourse in the middle of the 12th century, 13th century. In other words, I will try to describe the different modes of perception of astrology that developed in this period in order to find out in how far and in which sense astrology can be called an esoteric science at the moment when it became, in fact, a central issue of philosophical, theological, and scientific discourse in the High Middle Ages. And here, in order to reveal you the final result already now, I will argue that, in fact, it is helpful to use the category of esotericism or esoteric science, but that it has to be done with great caution. Okay. The first text I would like to discuss here is more than 2,000 years old. It's Cicero's argument against astrology in his De Divinatione. As you probably all know, Cicero's De Divinatione is fashioned as a kind of learned dispute between Cicero himself and his brother, Quintus. Quintus is depicted as a Stoic who defends and justifies the practice and theory of various forms of divination on Stoic philosophical grounds in the first book, and the second book is entirely devoted to Cicero's skeptical refutation of this position. And in chapters 42 to 48, he speaks about astrology and first refers the justification of the defenders of astrology, where he says, I quote, that's a text you can see here for 2 more seconds. Those men who defend the natal day prophecies of the Chaldeans argue in this way. In the starry belt, which the Greeks call the zodiac, there is a certain force of such a nature that every part of the belt affects and changes the heavens in different way according to the stars that are in this or in an adjoining locality at a given time. Now, since through the procession and retrogression of the stars the great variety and change of the seasons and of temperature take place, and since the power of the sun produces such results as are before our eyes, they believe that it is not merely probable but certain that just as the temperature of the air is regulated by the celestial force, so also children and their birth are influenced in soul and body, and by this force their minds, manners, disposition, physical condition, career in life, and destinies are determined. I think that there are two interesting points in this defense of astrology, which Cicero reports. First, the defender of astrology remains rather unspecific regarding the actual functioning of the astral influence. He simply speaks about a certain force, vim quadam esse in Latin, which resides in the zodiac. And secondly, he bases his defense of astrology on the absolutely evident and obvious fact that the stars, most notably the sun, do exert some kind of influence on the terrestrial sphere. Accordingly, it is not merely, this is the defense here, likely but certain that such an influence exists. As it is well known, the defense of astrology reported by Cicero here probably owes much to the Stoic philosophy of Posidonius. But what and how did Cicero react to this position? It is the absolutely obvious and self-evident fact of the influence of the stars which forms the basis of the defense for astrology, as we have seen. So it also has to be exactly the seemingly self-evident character of astrology which had to become the main target of Cicero's skeptical attack. Whereas the adherents of astrology think to have won a very easy battle, Cicero adduces a long series of arguments in order to challenge exactly this assumption. In a manner which is clearly reminiscent of ancient skepticism, he condensed, for example, that the physical distance of the stars make it utterly unlikely that they have any influence, and it uses many other arguments, for example, the fate of twins and so on. In other words, in Cicero's work, astrology is conceived by neither of the parties, nor the defenders nor the critics of astrology, as a form of esoteric knowledge. And this not with respect to the functioning of it, to the force which are involved, nor to the status of knowledge. Quite to the contrary, it is the empirically self-evident character of astrology which is the main argument in favor of astrology, and conversely the main target of skeptical criticism. It is quite interesting to see that during most of antiquity, the theoretical defense of astrology mostly remained on this rather low level. Admittedly, the Stoic concept of cosmic sympathy, sympatheia, provided a certain tool to conceptualize the functioning of astral influence, but there is surprisingly little evidence for a solid scientific argument in favor of the truth or the possibility of astrology based upon the principles of ancient physics. This surprising lack of depth on the theoretical level in most of the ancient criticism and justification of astrology can still be observed in the first chapters of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, written about 200 years after Cicero's De Divinatione. Ptolemy's defense of astrology is based upon the assumption that there are two parts of astronomy, as he calls it. One, I quote, which is first both in order and in effectiveness, is that whereby we apprehend the aspects of the movements of sun, moon, and stars in relation to each other and to the earth as they occur from time to time. The second is that which by means of the natural character of these aspects themselves we investigate the changes which they bring about in that they surround. But whereas the reliability of the first mathematical astronomical part of astronomy is beyond dispute also for Ptolemy, Ptolemy is well aware that the practical application of astronomy, what we would nowadays call astrology, is prone to various skeptical attacks. And therefore he adds, we shall now give an account of the second and less self-sufficient method in a properly philosophical way, so that one whose aim is a truth might never compare its perceptions with the sureness of the first, that's astronomy, unvarying science, for he ascribes to it the weakness and unpredictability of material qualities found in individual things, nor yet refrain from such investigation as is within the bounds of probability, when it is so evident that most events of general nature draw their causes from the enveloping heavens. Ptolemy then adds some arguments showing that the sun and the moon and the stars indeed emanate some kind of power, and then finally can come to the conclusion that, I quote here, that's not found here, criticism about the score of impossibility has been specious but undeserved. In other words, astrology is, according to Ptolemy, in fact less secure than astronomy. It is also more difficult to attain and is thus more susceptible to mistakes. But all this should not restrain us from studying it because, again, astrology is obviously possible and also beneficial. That there is no need to go more into, there's no more need to go more into details about these arguments, because it has become sufficiently clear on which level the dispute about astrology was largely carried out. That of the largely self-evident character of the possibility and truth of astrology, as opposed to skeptical, and really skeptical, not dogmatic, doubts raised against its opponents, by its opponents. Whereas the systematic investigation of the physical foundations of astrology was hardly attempted. There are only very few exceptions. For example, Plotinus tries to do that. Nothing indicates that there is anything about judicial astronomy, and this is the only form of astrology we have met so far, which deserves to be esoteric. It's perhaps not totally surprising to see that this weak scientific justification of astrology, based upon its self-evident character, did not fundamentally change in the Christian discourse about astrology. If we take Augustine's refutation of astrology in the 5th book of the De Civitate Dei as an example in case, we find there the very same skeptical set of arguments that was leveled against judicial astrology by Cicero almost half a millennium before. What is important to Augustine is to stress that in spite of the seemingly obvious character of sidereal influence, the freedom of human will, which is for him the basis of moral behavior, remains unaffected. So he says in De Civitate Dei, it is not entirely absurd to say with reference only to physical differences, that there are certain sidereal influences. We see that the seasons of the year change with the approach and the receding of the sun, and with the waxing and waning of the moon we see certain kinds of things grow and shrink, such as sea urchins and oysters, and the marvelous tides of the ocean. But the choices of the will are not subject to the positions of the stars. In addition to the ethical consequences, astrological fatalism is also raises also problems about God's almightiness, which concerns Augustine, of course, as a theological thinker. But if we follow Kocke von Struckrad's argument in his book Das Ringen um die Astrologie, we observe in Augustine the symptoms of a general tendency in the Christian Roman Empire to remove astrology from the public discourse. And this was obviously a long process, which initially started with a quite ambivalent Christian attitude towards astrology, and then to its growing theological and political criminalization, which can later be discerned also in the recurrent laws of the Christian Roman emperors against the astrologers. Now, it is well possible that the Christian criminalization of judicial astrology in the later Roman Empire was a step towards its social esoterization, but as far as I can see, there's not very much evidence for an immediate development into this direction. As far as I can see, the prohibition of astrology did not lead to a large-scale enclosure of astrological knowledge into inner circles of master-disciple instruction. However, what is more significant for the longue durée developments is a second phenomenon, which can be also observed in Augustine's writings. It is the ever-growing Christian obsession with the problem of demons and demon cult. This concern has partly grown out of the Christian dialogue with the Neoplatonists, but also with Hermeticism. It should be noted, however, that the Hermeticism, which Augustine attacks in the 8th book of De Civitate Dei, is still basically unastrological, and it is only in his refutation of the Neoplatonic concept of theurgy that some small parts of astrological things pop up, like astrological drawings. In short, what we find in Augustine is side by side with the skeptical and theological refutation of judicial astrology, a tendency to associate certain forms of astromagic with rather suspect demonic powers, which bring them all in all too close vicinity to idolatry. Now, I would like to invite you to travel with me to the east and cast an eye on a totally different realm, that of the Arab-Muslim culture during the last centuries of the first millennium. This culture and period which was so important for the transmission of ancient knowledge to the Middle Ages. Now, as you all know, during the Abbasid era, the Arabs were extremely eager to translate and adopt whatever they could get hold of from the scientific heritage of antiquity. Astrology was not only part of that, more than that, as Dimitri Gutas has shown in his seminal book, Greek Thought, Arabic Culture, the Greco-Arabic translation movement in Baghdad and the early Abbasid society. The interest in astrology, and here especially in historical astrology, in fact played a pivotal role in the whole process. A meaningful document for this is a description of the Caliph al-Mansur in the Muruj al-Dhahab of the 10th century Arab historian al-Mas'udi, who writes about the Caliph who reigned from 754 to 775. He was, I quote, the first Caliph to favor astrologers and to act on the basis of astrological prognostications. He had in his retinue the astrologer Naubacht the Zoroastrian, also in his retinue with the astrologer Ibrahim al-Fazari, and so on, and Ali, even the astrologist. He was the first Caliph to have books translated from foreign languages into Arabic, among them Khalil al-Dimna and Sinhind, and the Almagest and Nicomachos, and many other books. This indicates that unlike in the Christian Roman Empire, where astrology was gradually marginalized, astrology was conceived as being part and parcel of the scientific heritage by the Arabic translation movement. The question here was not whether the astrology should be studied, but rather where to locate this famous and not at all esoteric science within the corpus of sciences that were newly imported from the Hellenistic world or culture. In order to organize this newly adopted knowledge, Arabic authors of the 9th and 10th century composed various works on the what is called classification of sciences, introductory catalogues of the various branches of science that can be studied, and the relation between those branches of science. As Dimitri Gutas has shown in his article published in Der Islam in 1983, these classifications of sciences more or less directly rely on models adopted from introductory works produced for the Platonic Aristotelian study programs of the schools in Alexandria and late antiquity. It goes almost without saying that these models in the philosophical schools of antiquity did not include astrology among the sciences to be studied. So it is quite conspicuous to see that and how the Arabic adaptations in fact always assign to astrology a place in their works. This phenomenon undoubtedly is a result of the high prestige astrology enjoyed in the intellectual discourse in the Arab world during that period of time. The first to do so was the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, but in a more systematic way, here we are. This was done by Al-Farabi, who worked in the 10th century, who writes in his enumeration Ihsa al-Ulum on astrology the following: that what is known by this name, Klumar Ilm al-Nujum, is two sciences. One of them is the science of the judgments of the stars, And this is the science of the portents of the stars about what will happen in the future and about many things that now exist and about many things that happened before. And the second one is the mathematical science of the stars, and this one is the one which is counted among the sciences and among the teachings. And regarding the former one, that is astrology, this is rather counted among the faculty and arts, akua wal mihan, by which man is able to give warnings about what will happen, similarly to the interpretation of dreams, to the crowing of birds, and the flying of birds and similar things. Here we can see in Al-Farabi that judicial astrology was integrated as a part of the system of sciences, and similarly to Ptolemy before him, it appears as a second branch of astronomy, even though Al-Farabi seems to be slightly more skeptical about the scientific value than Ptolemy was. What characterizes judicial astrology is the more technical, experimental, or even empirical character, which renders it into an art rather than a deductive science in the strict sense of the word. This is also what makes it similar to dream interpretation. But whatever Al-Farabi's personal attitude towards the scientific value and reliability of astrology was, and actually there are good reasons to believe that it was not too positive, nothing indicates that astrology should be seen as an esoteric science in the proper sense of the word, not with respect to its functioning, nor to its epistemological, social, legal, or political status. A similar stance was taken by a second Arabic philosopher, Ibn Sina, who lived in the 10th and 11th century. Unlike Al-Farabi, he made his doubts about the reliability of judicial astrology explicit in a work dedicated to the refutation of judicial astrology, Risala fi Ibtal Ahkam an-Nujum. But in his own classification of the sciences, found in the Risala fi Aqsam al-Ulum al-Aqliya, the epistle on the parts of the rational sciences, he still mentions astrology among many other parts of the applied wisdom about nature, al-Hikmah al-Far'iyya al-Tabi'iyya, like medicine, chiromancy, dream interpretation, talismans, magic, niranjat, and alchemy, as opposed to the branches of Aristotelian physics, which are the science about the principles of nature. Now, I think there are two interesting points in Ibn Sina's classification of astrology among the applied natural sciences. First, whereas Ptolemy and Al-Farabi, for them, astrology was the practical sister of astronomy, which belongs to mathematics, Ibn Sina disconnects astrology from astronomy, which remains here, like in all the other works and in Greek tradition, part of the mathematical science, and inserts it into a list of sciences, most of which are explicitly connected with what can be called occult powers, like talismanic art, about which he says, for example, and the aim of it is the mixture of the powers of some of the terrestrial borders, in order to compose from this a power that causes abnormal event, fi'lan ghariban, in the terrestrial world. In other words, Ibn Sina does not only add a few new branches of applied natural sciences like astromagic to his catalogue, which never were considered sciences before, and became part of the canon of the classification of sciences. That would have been interesting enough. He also, again, disconnects astrology from its initial partnership with astronomy and inserts it into a group of sciences whose functioning and theoretical foundation is based upon the assumption that there are secret, hidden, esoteric powers. Ibn Sina's reinterpretation of the place of astrology in the system of science, of course, did not come out of the blue. It rather reflects a growing interest in the study of learned magic and astrology in the Arab-Muslim world during the 10th and 11th centuries. As an example, one could mention here the Brethren of Purity in the 10th century, who also provide or give astrology a place very close to magic in their last letter or epistle on magic. And another example is, of course, the Psychiatric, the Rayat al-Hakim of al-Majriti, who apparently lived and worked during the 10th century. His book is not only an encyclopedia of magic and most importantly of astromagic, it is also a document for the attempts during this period to develop a comprehensive concept of the workings of astral powers and the secret sciences. In an attempt to characterize this kind of astrological magic, Al-Majriti writes in the second chapter of the first book, magic, sihr, is something that is difficult to comprehend, and its causes are hidden from the ignorant people. This is the cause because it is a divine power which is active from preceding causes, which are the precondition for its understanding. It is a science which is difficult to grasp. In short, magic is something the cause of which is not accessible to the majority of men and which is too difficult to be found by them. So what we can observe here is a radically different function and image of astrology from which we have started our journey. The astrology described here is one which, on the theoretical level, is mainly occupied with secret powers, and it is, on the practical level, a science produced in more small circles of adepts. In other words, the astrology of the Rayat al-Hakim has become an esoteric science in the double sense of the term. It is a science where the object of knowledge is esoteric, and the status of the knowledge is esoteric in itself too. So before coming to my conclusions, I would like to add one more example to these sources about the various statuses of astrology. In the 17th section of the famous Incoherence of Philosophers of Al-Ghazali, this philosopher-theologian refutes the Aristotelian concept of causality and tries to defend his own occasionalistic approach to this problem, which allows for the constant interference of God in the physical processes. It would lead us too far here to go into details, but what is interesting to see here is that Al-Ghazali explicitly uses astromagic as an example, indicating that internal physical causality is not the only possible foundation for physical processes, and not even for miracles. And so therefore he writes in his Tahafut al-Falasifa, from this, it has become clear that the principles of dispositions include strange and wondrous things, so much that the masters of the talismanic arts have arrived, through their knowledge of the special properties of mineral substances and knowledge of the stars, at the ability to combine the heavenly powers and the special properties of minerals. Thus, they have at times repelled from one town the snake and the scorpion, from another town the bedbug, and so on to matters known in the talismanic art. The denial of this, it's still here, yeah. The denial of this is only due to our lack of capacity to understand, of our lack of familiarity with the exalted beings, and our awareness of the secrets of God, praise be He, in creation and nature. Whoever studies inductively the wonders of the sciences will not deem remote from the power of God in any manner whatsoever what has been related of miracles of the miracles of the prophets. Unfortunately, my time does not allow me to go on to describe the complicated history of astrology in medieval cultures in that detail as I've done it until now. But I think that the survey of the development until the beginning of the 11th century has so far provided us with the necessary pieces in order to put together the mosaic. A medieval scholar, be he Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, what would he think about astrology as an esoteric science? What would he have to answer if he was asked whether astrology is an esoteric science? According to my impression, his answer to this question would have been rather unambiguous. It couldn't have been unambiguous. Quite to the contrary, most scholars who were active and entering the discourse about astrology in the Middle Ages had in front of them a wide range of possibilities how to understand and describe the functioning of astrology and its epistemological, religious, legal, and social status. Almost all the sources, or at least ideas and arguments which I've mentioned here, were in one way or the other accessible to the whole medieval world. And it was the choice of each scholar to adopt one or even more of them. For this reason, I think that we can observe an enormous variety of often conflicting images of astrology in the Middle Ages, sometimes even within one and the same person. Let me just give a few examples, which sometimes really pose a problem to interpreters. If we take Abraham ibn Ezra, we can see how he teaches astrology without the slightest hint to esotericism in his so-called astrological encyclopedia. which is really very much in the tradition of the exoteric, self-evident tradition of Ptolemy. But he also could use astrology, or more precisely historical astrology and astromagic, as foundations for his esoteric interpretations in his biblical commentaries. Thomas of Aquinas was prepared to accept a certain amount of astral influence on the terrestrial world, because such influence cannot reasonably be denied, as he writes in his Summa Theologiae. But he is extremely wary of the usage of both judicial astrology and astromagic, the former because of its scientific uncertainty, which leaves room for demonic interference, the latter because it implies either an explicit or implicit pact with demonic powers. The influence of Augustine becomes patent here. On the other hand, the unknown author of the Speculum Astronomiae tried to defend judicial astrology on the basis of its close linkage with unesoteric scientific astronomy, and argues for the possibility of natural magic, which, according to his interpretation, avoids, in certain cases, the involvement of demons. Moreover, one should not assume even that the association of astrology with esoteric, occult, and even demonic powers was always a reason for its refutation. On the contrary, a Jewish scholar like Nachmanides could well argue in his biblical commentaries for the scientific truth of astral magic, even if its practice might be restricted by the law, in order to refute explicitly Aristotelian science. The parallelism to Al-Ghazali and the historical connection is not yet clear to me between Al-Ghazali and Nachmanides at this point is clear, but it's obviously the adoption of Al-Ghazali's conception of astrology, astromagic as esoteric science, which was prepared by the anti-astrological Ibn Sina, which finds a very interesting parallel here. In other words, what I would like to argue is that astrology was an outspokenly ambiguous phenomenon when it reached the Middle Ages. It could be conceived as an esoteric science in the sense that it deals with hidden powers, unexplained and inexplicable within the framework of natural philosophy, but it could also be seen as a science, the framework of which, or the foundation working of which, is perfectly patent to anybody who wants to look on a bright sunny day on the world which is around him. The same self-evident character could be questioned on skeptical rather than scientific grounds, thus revealing the unjustified presumptions of the astrologers. Astrology could appear as a science that could and should be taught publicly, but also as one that is either dangerous or beyond the understanding of regular men, and thus needs to be hidden, forbidden, and or transmitted in esoteric circles. In short, what I want to say is if astrology seems to be a core discipline of Western esotericism, for the student of esotericism, it is, but it is also often not an esoteric science for the student of cultural and intellectual history.